The political and social landscape of the southeastern region of Nigeria has just been hit by what is arguably the most devastating and heavily explosive revelation since the inception of the modern Biafran agitation, because a highly placed insider has officially stepped forward to completely shatter the carefully constructed image of the detained leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, Nnamdi Kanu. For years, millions of highly passionate followers across the entire globe have absolutely revered him as the ultimate savior of the Igbo people, a messianic figure who allegedly sacrificed his immense personal freedom for the ultimate liberation of the marginalized. However, a massive new leak from the very inner circle of the separatist movement has brutally exposed a deeply uncomfortable narrative, emphatically stating that Nnamdi Kanu absolutely does not care about the actual realization of a sovereign Biafran state, but has instead brilliantly weaponized the deeply rooted historical grievances of his people to sustain a highly lucrative ethnic enterprise. This massive revelation is currently sending absolute shockwaves through the massive network of diaspora funders and the heavily exhausted foot soldiers on the ground, fundamentally questioning the absolute core of a struggle that has aggressively consumed thousands of innocent lives and completely paralyzed the economic heartbeat of the entire region. To properly understand the massive gravity of this insider confession, we must actively look at the highly chaotic reality of the year 2026, a year that has completely redefined the entire structure of the separatist movement. Late last year, specifically in November 2025, the Federal High Court sitting in Abuja, under the strict supervision of Justice James Omotosho, officially found Nnamdi Kanu heavily guilty of terrorism and handed down a devastating life imprisonment sentence. The highly explosive insider report heavily details exactly how the entire agitation was aggressively monetized right from the very beginning. According to the deeply fascinating disclosures, the massive international broadcasts on Radio Biafra were never genuinely designed to lay the actual diplomatic groundwork for a new nation, but were rather highly calculated emotional triggers heavily intended to aggressively stimulate massive financial donations from the highly successful Igbo diaspora community living in the United States, the United Kingdom, and across Europe. The insider completely alleges that while young, highly impressionable men were being actively radicalized to aggressively confront the heavily armed Nigerian military in the thick forest of the southeast, the massive millions of dollars pouring into the massive secretive defense funds were completely unaccounted for. This deeply shocking narrative heavily aligned with the massive internal war that has completely torn the indigenous people of Biafra apart over the last few years. Following Nnamdi Kanu's highly controversial extraordinary rendition from Kenya in 2021, a massive power vacuum was heavily created, which Simon Ekpa aggressively exploited to completely hijack the heavily armed militant wing of the movement. Kanu's loyalists, actively operating under the Directorate of State, have spent the last few years desperately trying to completely distance their supreme leader from the massive atrocities actively committed by Ekpa's heavily radicalized autopilot faction. But the highly credible insider who has just spilled everything completely argues that this massive separation is entirely hypocritical. The deeply explosive claim completely suggests that Kanu actually laid the very violent foundation that Ekpa simply inherited and aggressively amplified by heavily promoting a highly uncompromising and deeply hostile rhetoric that heavily labeled Nigeria as a complete zoo and aggressively called for the absolute destruction of national infrastructure. The original leadership completely normalized the extreme violence that eventually spiraled completely out of their control. The insider heavily maintained that if Nnamdi Kanu genuinely cared about the absolute welfare, the massive economic prosperity, and the actual physical survival of the Igbo people, he would have actively engaged in highly strategic political negotiations with the massive political elites when he had the absolute chance, rather than heavily insulting highly respected religious leaders, completely disrespecting massive traditional institutions, and aggressively alienating other ethnic groups across the country. It is absolutely fascinating to actively observe how the massive political intelligentsia of the Southeast is currently reacting to this complete collapse of the separatist leadership. The Southeast, historically recognized as the absolute commercial and deeply entrepreneurial powerhouse of the entire West African sub-region, has completely suffered massive multi-billion naira losses due to the highly enforced weekly sit-at-home orders. Highly successful businesses have completely relocated to Lagos and Abuja. Heavily international investors have completely fled the region, and massive local markets have been repeatedly shut down by heavily armed non-state actors who actively claim to be heavily fighting for the absolute freedom of the people. The insider's highly explosive revelation that the massive leadership did not actually care about the real-world consequences of these highly destructive actions completely validates the deep, massive frustrations of the everyday traders in Aba, the highly hard-working artisans in Onitsha, and the deeply exhausted civil servants in Enugu who have completely borne the massive brunt of this highly unnecessary violence. Furthermore, the highly dramatic legal theatrics actively playing out in the Federal Court of Appeal in Abuja completely add another massive layer to this deeply complex story. Just recently, in February 2026, Nnamdi Kanu heavily approached the appellate court to completely overturn his massive life sentence, aggressively arguing that the trial judge completely failed to allow a proper allocutus before actively handing down the maximum punishment. But even his highly dedicated legal team has completely experienced massive internal turmoil. Late last year, in a highly surprising move that completely shocked legal observers, Nnamdi Kanu aggressively dismissed his entire highly experienced legal defense team right in the middle of a highly critical court proceeding. He actively complained that he was completely denied massive access to his own highly important case files, completely stalling his own defense. This highly erratic behavior perfectly mirrors the deeply inconsistent leadership style heavily highlighted by the massive insider, who completely claims that the entire struggle has always been centered around massive personal ego and absolute control rather than highly strategic legal or massive political advancement. The insider heavily pointed out that while Kanu actively hires massive international lobbying firms in the United States, including those actively owned by former American congressmen, to aggressively push a highly exaggerated narrative of a massive religious genocide to prominent political figures like Donald Trump, the actual massive reality on the ground in the Southeast is a highly tragic story of complete self-inflicted economic sabotage and massive internal bloodletting. It is highly imperative to deeply note that the official massive leadership of the indigenous people of Biafra, heavily represented by their massive spokesperson Emma Powerful, have completely continued to heavily reject any massive association with the highly violent elements currently terrorizing the region. They have aggressively released massive statements completely dismissing Simon Ekpa as a highly deranged criminal and a massive creation of the Nigerian government, heavily designed to completely undermine their allegedly peaceful massive movement. They aggressively point to Kanu's highly publicized massive efforts during the heavy global pandemic to heavily distribute massive food relief and actively establish the Eastern Security Network to heavily protect massive local farmlands from highly violent invaders. It is up to you to decide for how much longer will the massive millions of highly hardworking and deeply brilliant people of the Southeast completely allow their massive economic future, their highly sacred massive lives, and their massive political relevance in the larger Nigerian state to be completely held heavily hostage by a massive group of heavily disjointed, highly egocentric, and deeply compromised diaspora actors who completely operate from the massive safety and highly comfortable luxury of European and North American cities. The massive federal government has completely demonstrated its highly aggressive resolve to completely crush the massive violent aspects of this heavily disruptive agitation through highly coordinated military operations and deeply aggressive legal prosecutions. But absolute massive permanent peace will only completely return to the heavily troubled region when the massive local population completely rejects the highly manipulative massive rhetoric of these highly exposed leaders. We want to actively pass this conversation directly over to you because your highly intelligent massive perspective is absolutely vital. Do you personally heavily believe this massive insider's highly explosive claim that Nnamdi Kanu and the massive diaspora leadership absolutely never cared about the actual massive realization of Biafra, but only
only used it as a massive financial enterprise? Or do you think this is just another massive, highly coordinated government propaganda heavily designed to completely destroy the massive remaining support for the deeply imprisoned leader?